"Who are you?" she asked him, his face quite literally blanked. And yet, he fixed a look at her, sardonic, with a tilt of his head, and asked in return, his voice resonating in the concrete bunker, "You know all the answers to that." The tone in her voice revealed that yes, she did. "What are you?" There was a long pause. He sat back, relaxing, as if easing into the following conversation. "I am that I am." No, back up. He says, there's the rub first. And she retorts with a quizzical look. He mutters something about Shakespeare and how it wasn't one guy, but a group of people and women who wrote the plays. She looked even more perplexed. He brushes all that aside with a never mind. "I am that I am." "Okay," she asks, "and what is that?" "Depends on how you define things, but to put it as simply as possible." He leaned forward, as if to emphasize what he was about to say. The tone of his voice dropped a bit. "I am a living, nanotechnological, non-biological, tactical, cellular, solid state, cybernetic being that has achieved and transcended personhood." The pause between them lasted an eternity. "And what is that? How? Perhaps some of these concepts have yet to be developed and deployed here in your framework, in your planet, in your time frame. Each species that achieves personhood and then begins the journey through their technological evolution towards whatever form of transcendence they might achieve, eventually develops technologies made of artificial, non-living nanoparticles that are, to some degree or another, sentient, self-aware, self-replicating, and semi-autonomous in their ability to execute directives and organize with one another. In my universe, in my time frame, in my planet, and we say in our planet because we understand it to be a multidimensional, living, cosmic womb, which is nurturing and gestating and giving birth to all the life forms which are striving towards personhood. You guys objectified her into, at first, I think, from your earliest accounts, a stationary, inanimate object that belonged to you for some reason or another. Couldn't have been further from the truth, my dear. Macknaley pauses the tape. Meta reference, what we've been listening to is the audio recording of an interview or a conversation that occurred 15 years prior to the moment Macknaley is currently living. She's sitting in her penthouse suite security office at the Alphabet Soup headquarters of her totally secret government tactical agency, whose actual name I do not have in front of me, nor do I recall off the top of my head, but I've coined a few ideas for it. Insert some possible ideas. The writer stopped and thought, that's a terrible way to leave things, but I'll updraft it later. Meta reference back, the writer's staring at the tape recorder, wondering if any of this will make sense to the audience, whether or not this narrative mechanic will eventually find its rhythm and its pacing, whether or not he'll ever get around to actually putting this all together into a cohesive and well-structured book series, and being entirely unsure about what to do next, and how to transition from the scene that was going on, most of which he now can't remember, that just came out of his mouth, and what thoughts and pins on the corkboard dots that must be connected Macknaley has to have in this scene we've now created, where she's sitting in her office, having gone through every object in the box, the mysterious box that's referenced at the beginning of the book. And this is the last object. A small, almost overlooked memory readback card that had managed to wedge itself under one of the box flaps. You know, boxes, folding boxes, they got flaps that overlap. But it had shaken loose just at the right moment when she was about to chuck that box off to some conveyor belt that took away items to be sorted and ultimately disposed of. Her office being both futuristically high-tech and sleek, and yet somehow anachronistically, simultaneously retro and very Brazil-esque. And by that I mean we're referencing Terry Gilliam's scenic design choices for his masterpiece film, Brazil. You haven't seen it? What? Writer A is astonished that writer B has not seen it. And they hadn't. A conversation ensues, which I'm not prepared to articulate here and now, but must be drafted in during the updrafting phase of the process. But you can imagine how it might go. Writer A has seen the movie and presumes it to be a classic that most people at least have heard of. Writer B is like, the hell are you talking about? I've never heard of this movie, and I'm a movie snob. And they go round and round, writer A discussing and analyzing and proposing the importance and significance and meaning of Terry Gilliam's admittedly very cryptic and absurdist and potentially completely meaningless film. Meaningless in that very deliciously good way, because it's meant to be a Rorschach blot and not a narrative lecture. But I digress. The writers, having dusted up about the film and then set the subject aside, return to the issue at hand. What aha moments can Macknaley have here? Well, obviously, we have to talk about her relationship with the woman in the box that's trapped with the incorrigible MrZeppo, the villain that this woman trapped in the box with him has been pursuing for untold periods of time. Enough that it's a trope, a thing between them, a cat and mouse game. Oh, there should be some fun reference to killing Eve here. Yes, I agree. Very well. Okay. And then, well, obviously, we've already explored a little bit, but we should reveal as we return Macknaley's attention to the audio content, because she has to imagine it. She doesn't have a video feed, right? She doesn't have like a reconstruction model. She just has this raw data. And of course, we'll have to deal with the nuanced complexities of the fact that Macknaley actually lives in a virtual environment like the Matrix. So the fact that she's cosplaying this in a virtual world has real life significance, and we want to associate those kinds of significances or concordances to audience with standard, normal, real world things. Like if you're driving a car in the Matrix, I can't use that word. If you're driving a vehicle or flying or traveling in sort of quote unquote semi-lucid real time in the virtual reality realm, you're actually also doing that out in the real world. Probably still inside your encapsulating pod egg thing, which we still gotta figure out a name for. Yes, but don't get caught up in that. The naming game we can play way later towards the end. Okay, fine. I digress. Digression. So we have to acknowledge what Macknaley's really doing. In other words, where her pod is in the quote unquote real world. And also, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, let those who know that yes, we know and should know, everyone who really knows should know that even that is a virtual lie in this world. Like, people think that when they transport their pods, they really are transporting their pods in the real world. Little do they know that none of the real worlds in this very heavily saturated with virtual augmentation world that they all think they live in exist in their natural state anymore because of the resource-devouring monoliths. If you don't know what I'm talking about, there are pins on the corkboard. If you do, good on you for being caught up to date. Yes. We should hint at all that in a very fun and nuanced and complex ways. Of course. Both writers agreed. And we're very unsure about what to actually set down, pen to paper, as it were. Not that they ever used pen and paper, but you see the analogy. Yes, well, never mind. Either way, one proceeded to transition. We then bring the audience attention back to the fact that she's like 69% certain, but has some big doubts and does not want to believe that the voice of the woman on the audio tape, which represents supposedly truly a physical piece of actual, like, physical data chip that's raw data audio tape that cannot be faked, in theory, is her former partner at the agency, like when they were field agents, before they each went up their own trajectory of chaotic changes in career paths. And of course, for those who really know, former lover, from when she was, from as back as the days when she was recruited into the agency and sent to the boot camp academy, etc. Right? Standard espionage stuff. But she's not 100% sure. And she was really sort of, oh God, I don't need one more thing. She's just spent God knows how many hours that were, of course, compressed and time dilated. Something we need to explain to the audience, perhaps, in this moment here for her, in terms of where she works and the places she inhabits and how many levels of time dilation that really is, and where her reality is and what's going on with that. In other words, when she, quote unquote, steps out of her pod, which, by the way, in terms of the real world lie history, the pseudo history of what's going on there, humanity is slowly growing, increasingly inclined towards permanent and maybe even non-reversible enclosure in their safety hologram pods, because they provide all health and biological functions and services needed to keep the physical body healthy and in great physical shape, right? While it's impregnably secure. Like, it's the safest. If you could think of this pod, if you just set aside the video game part of it, right? Like it is in part inspired by Ready Player One's VR chair, which also sort of never made sense. But this is a VR tank that is akin to a hybridization of the Matrix goo pod, the piloting safety titanium. I don't know why I want to say titanium, but metal environment protection pod that your character resides in full time in Eve, the video game, for anyone who knows that. Big reference there, pin on the corkboard. I want to go back to playing that, but it's such a huge time sink. Everything takes so much time, it's crazy. It's like, Writer C has been sitting back this entire time, observing this writer's block sidebar, and finally leans in and speaks up. Hey, team, back to the moment at hand. She needs to press play. Right. Macknaley, with incomprehensible questions and fears and insecurities and doubts and wishes that it were not so, but with a growing intuitive, I know the sound of her voice, knowing, a growing certainty that it has to be. But a conflict of interests in her mind because it cannot physically be forgiving Bobby McGee, the woman who recruited her and seduced her into the life she leads now as the top active field agent in charge of global security espionage operations. It just physically couldn't be, right? Based on the sourcing of this archived footage or digital. Well, I'm also up in the air about, we are also up in the air about whether or not the writers team is like, is this supposed to be a digital thing, or is it like a tape recording, like a 1989 like dual length cassette where the tape was packed in there. You know those? The cassette was the same size, but it was the maximal amount of tape you could cram into the box and it could still function correctly. And I forget how many extra bonus minutes and or hours of audio tape you got out of it, but I think it's better that it's that. And so that in her investigative simulation, her office is almost entirely a simulation. Her pod arrives and it's a hyper secure blank cube where other people's pods can also arrive so they can, virtually be in the same room together without actually leaving their pods. And it'd be the closest thing to actually being in the same room together in complete and total, like, top tier, like, no one knows where this location is except for the people that have access to it and can have these top secure meetings. And she's like the leader of this group. And the only other people that we know of from the agency, because we don't get into the minutia of daily operations, and like the people at the chair, because there's armies of support staff, and of course boots on the ground and several tiers of operatives in various organizational structures. Yes, all the writers agreed that they still need to work and flesh all that out so there's detail there for the world-building fanatics that will devour that stuff up. But the important part is that she's in this room alone currently, having just concluded and filed a report summarizing for everyone else who did not participate in the personal review in super ratcheted down compressed time. So she could spend infinity reviewing the minutia of the entirety of all the contents of what was in the box, which there was multiple lifetimes worth of archived information, right? because they represent the lineage of all the many lifetimes of Mr. Zeppo, which is an homage to the many adventures of anything you've ever heard the many adventures of. But it's the many lifetimes of Mr. Zeppo, is where we get like snippets and short stories and vignettes and kind of maybe even cross-generational montages of this character existing throughout human history as some sort of a cult figure, a human archetype, a demigod, a god. No one knows, right? But only he is common myth and rumor, and there's like a standing mythology about him, for which we have not made like definitions and names and stuff. But it's got to be like abstractly, completely different from what the agency has compiled as their assessment, which they briefed Macknaley on. Which, bottom line, he's some sort of criminal that must be stopped. He's doing something that is dangerous to both their agency, and I like using both ironically by then proceeding to do a whole list. It's sort of a bit of that I do, so just roll with it. It's both a threat to their agency and to the nation that they are, in theory, tasked to defend, right? And protect and inform. And also the global world order that is already sort of rocked with actual rebellion as opposed to staged rebellions, etc. All of which is, contextually speaking, by the way, the meta context of that, for anyone who doesn't know, is a corrupted and sort of turned sour and unnecessarily dystopian hologram. It's totally a virtual lie, which is physically, tangibly as close to reality as one could ever hope to design. Because the lie is, you are not, it's just like, I am indeed homaging the Matrix, but this lie is not a lie in the Zeppoverse, because humanity in this world, which is what Zeppo's like trying to like get them to understand, because they've forgotten all of this. Okay, so the writers' meeting stopped because writer C has gone off on a tangent explaining the main character and his backstory to these writers who are new to the writing team, right? And they're just like, how does he know all this stuff? They don't know who he is, writer C. We don't know who he is as an audience. He's obviously the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo himself. So, continuing from where we left off, double checking that the audio tape is still going. The other two writers is just like, and writer, we should maybe call him writer Z. Would that be too on point? No, we need a decoy writer Z, because this is a very large writer's room, and they all have anonymous names. And there's like two teams, numbers and letters, and we'll get into it and break down and make cast lists later. But it's like 12 angry people, but they're all various like punny, jokey, stabby, trolly, but loving. Sorry, that was a poorly constructed sentence, but let's just keep going with it. Lovingly, comedic archetypes and reductions of like, people in it that are authors, people in the creative industry, et cetera, et cetera. People that would be found in a writer's room. So different kinds. Some of them are stand-up comics. Some of them are serious authors with a capital A, etc. Some of them are wild experimental playwrights. Some of them are nonconformist radicals that talk funny. That's a reference to a guy whose name I'm trying to pull his name up. Is it Jack Kerouac? Oh, no. We got it. Okay, but we also got to make a Jack Kerouac reference. But I was thinking of the singer too. I guess I always think of them together. I always think of them as like a writing team. Kerouac and Dylan? Yeah. We need a writing team in there. That one of them is numbers and the other one is letters. There's only two. There's like a division like that, but it's an artificial division because we need the juxtaposition of a leftist, rightist, tug of war, echo chamber type setup for the writers team. Anyways, writer C is the the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. And he's been on a tangent about who Mr. Zeppo is in terms of this story. And he's trying to get these two writers back on track because they've been tasked with working this scene and making it as meta as possible so that it is confusing AF. So it's, okay, who are the two? Oh, I said it was writer A and writer B and writer C. So they are a team. They are, I guess, the top trifecta team in the letters echo chamber. And they're working on, extrapolating this layers of meta idea and how to apply it. We'll need to have a sort of mirror sequence for the top trifecta of writers 1, 2, and 3 and what they're working on. But I don't think that's ready to drop yet. My brain is just going, yes, let me cook on that for a minute. So back to this thing. One of the two writers, A or B, has an idea. Or they both have an idea, and they're both like, ah! And then writer C is like, okay, wait, just A. No, B, what's your idea? And B goes, wait, no, shit, it just blanked. And then, okay, A, what's yours? Macknaley refuses to listen to the audio tape. The rest of it. And sets it aside and, stops everything. And says, exit, says the secret code to, quote unquote, exit her pod. Which is, of course, secretly to Macknaley and to everyone who thinks they can do this, multiple layers of a lie. But we'll only sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge at that. Because we'll have two tandem shots, one of Macknaley getting out of the pod, looking incredibly sexy in whatever attire or lack thereof she's in the pod about. And it's got to be a big, show-stopping, complicated sequence. The other writer whose idea had forgotten is just jealously mouth agape. And of course, Zeppo as writer C is leaning in and kind of very gently supporting with nods and gentle mm-hms. Yeah, and okay, so we got two concurrent shots though. And it's set up with a master shot that is tonally different and has to be more gritty and real. Dingier, a little dirtier. Nothing gross, but it's a shot of the pod in this secure room, which maybe looks different enough to be is it the same room? Is the room a lie in terms of what is really going on in the real world where the real pod is? And this pod looks like it's never been opened, like it's an ancient artifact, right? Not with dust, not with maybe we could go with the stereotypical, it's in a tomb and there's cobwebs. We could, maybe. I don't know. What do you think? Don't worry about that. Keep going. And the alternative shot? A crisp, shiny, new, sexy. It mirrors the place she was in and the amenities there, but it's also more tangible, more really there. And so is Macknaley. When she steps out of this, I think she should be bare buck naked, and it should be classy, but also frank, 1970s real. You know what I'm saying? Everyone pauses. That could be risque. I mean, we've already are trying to push the risque button, aren't we? Yes, everyone agrees. But it's classy. If Linda Carter in Wonder Woman, but in some other movie, she did. She did? What? Another tangent about a Linda Carter movie where she's kind of has a sexy scene, which I can't remember whether or not she was full nude and it was almost porno or not. But we can play with different memories between writers A, B, and C. And this time it's different polemics. Whereas the people who knew, whoever knew who Bought Brazil was and the opposite guy had never heard of it. C has to step in there and be the one to point out to the ignorant that he is indeed ignorant, that it's not that obscure of a film. So we got to rearrange those things. The opposite guy knows this movie, which I cannot remember the movie of, but I do know that Linda Carter was in some movie, and I don't mean to infringe. It's just an homage. She's one of my many seminal inspirations of like female lead characters that were influential in my youth and that were probably not as free of problematic issues as we would wish they were now, but also were inspiring clearly to women and men, to girls and boys, maybe sometimes in not the best ways, right? But also I think oftentimes in good, positive, healthy, uplifting ways. And Wonder Woman is just an iconic character that I love and want to homage in many ways. And Linda Carter is just, an iconic classic film and TV star that sort of was underappreciated in her era and never, could have been bigger perhaps, could have made it in a bigger way, especially if she hadn't gotten sort of, I don't know what happened, but she's around now and I'm so excited to see her make appearances. It was awesome to see her be in a Wonder Woman movie as member of that collective. But I digress. Macknaley, right? Obviously, she's like an Amazonian Jessica Rabbit, impossible, hot. But I'm actually basing her on someone I met in college in terms of what I'm imagining and what I'm basing on. So if it's supposed to be the character as a fiction in like her more like, and there's layers to the way she exists. And this is me speaking as writer C, describing, like catching up writers 1 and 2, which have been randomly hired and promoted into the top positions out of the blue after some dramatic, dust up and falling out in the writer's room, which is lore and history we can get into, but pins on the corkboard. We'll have to come back to it. So they're sort of taking on this leadership mantle of a crazy project that's got way too many layers to it. And this is one of these critical scenes that has been worked on for ages and needs, has been, and so that's one of the things they don't know. And they're like, wait, what? Oh yeah, there's so many versions of this scene laying about. Can we see them? Absolutely not. Especially not until you've drafted something. But also, they may no longer exist. What? Well, they were put in a quantum uncertainty box for security reasons. Their faces indicated that they clearly could not comprehend what any of that meant. Never mind all that, writer C proceeded to guide them back towards the objective. Okay, I like what you just pitched. Yes. Not quite Lara Croft Tomb, not quite Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, but yes, there's an establishing shot that comes prior to the counter parallel shot that is the complicated, what's the word I'm looking for? Unboxing, literally the unboxing and releasing of Macknaley's supposed actual physical body. And we want it to look pretty darn real. Like we were saying, 70s, classy, but also really comfortable with nudity. Like, what's wrong with the human body? Now, the counterpoint, in the other room, the pod is not alone. But we don't realize that at first. The counterpoint, or dark establishing shot, as we might want to call it, is whatever it looks like. It is a really tight shot that only very gradually, incrementally widens in frame. Relative to the other shot, or sequence of shots, that are a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more maybe a little bit more fluid. Maybe it's a long, interesting, complicated one shot that hovers around in an impossible way the pod, the egg pod that is in this hyper secure. What would we call it? It's got to have a room. It's got to be dubbed something. It's sort of the it represents, this is her like super secure bunker console meeting room. And it's like the inverse opposite. It represents it's all white. It's cool. It's authoritative. It is the definition of being in control. Whoever sits in this room has access to everything. They have all the information in the world. They got computer consoles. They can start wars and end wars, right? The room in which the incorrigible MrZeppo and forgiving Bobby McGee, that's literally her name, backstory pinned on the corkboards, there's a whole book about it, is a room which we never encounter in the book with the title of the woman's name, because that book is specifically about establishing Bobby McGee, forgiving Bobby McGee before she ever gets into the part of the agency that leads her to then meet Macknaley. Okay? Complicated, I know. So this is years later. Forgiving Bobby McGee is like old, like grandma old. But to borrow a phrase, and I mean this with all due respect and admiration and beauty in the sense of empowerment, black don't crack, and she looks amazing. There has to be also that we have to have a way to know. There has to be an establishing shot or a real-time shot of this conversation. Yes. Bingo. Good. So that's the next thing we need to introduce. Got it. Okay. The two of you go work on that. Right. So they go and work on that. Writer C leans back and goes, I like where this is going. Cut to the real scene. The incorrigible MrZeppo and forgiving Bobby McGee, completely, like, not quite Game of Thrones white-haired, but really natural silver-haired, with a little bit of salt and pepper left, in maybe a good shock of solid black in her hair, right, somewhere, and then just she could be 50, she could be 39, she could be 182, she could be 200 years old. You couldn't know. She has the gravitas of a goddess that is, but all three, the maiden, what is it? Is it the maiden, the queen, and the crone? Or whatever it is we change the names to in the world. Right. Okay. We'll have to look that up. Pins on the corkboard. But they're sitting there speechless and, picking up that prolonged pause. In this shot, MrZeppo is like in the foreground, out of focus. We clearly recognize him because he's sitting in a chair with his arms bound behind him. And that's something that was established at some point earlier, which we need to go back and edit in to the things we've already laid down to this audio. Okay. McGee, whilst looking glamorous, looking not glamorous or fabulous, looking amazing and sort of ageless, is also worse for wear. Like, she's not there in a position of authority interviewing Zeppo. She's there, like, simultaneously in the same room with Zeppo for the same technical reasons as Zeppo would be. And it's not good. This is the opposite of the room upstairs, the all-white room, that we presumably encounter Macknaley exiting her pod. Now, in this world where everyone spends, like, their pod is, okay, let's zoom out. It's not quite a torture chamber, the black site room, but it is a discomfort detention room where interviews and interrogations are conducted. And it is implied that perhaps on occasion some light torturing, maybe even some violations of human rights law, but never, ever, ever gratuitously. That's a whole contextual thing that whenever we go here, it has to be implied or somehow inferred, either in the dialogue or in some of the context narrative, some of the narration leading us into it. or in some of the signage, right? It's got to have a very, like, although gross and abandoned looking, it is like the basement of the same building in which the White Room is, perhaps. And one of the key things is there are half pods here. In other words, you can get plugged in, but part of the discomfort of this room is that you're being denied access to it. So it's a bit of psychological torture that you can sit in a thing that essentially reminds you of what your pod is like when you get in it before it closes in, cocoons around you. And I still haven't figured out what that looks like. But the shot happening upstairs in Macknaley's top tier, where she and her peers that run the agency's operations meet. There's only 1 or 2 levels above their room, and they have different code names. I don't have a code name for this room yet, but for now we just call it, referencing it as the clean room or the secure room. What is that word that they use when a secure skiff? It's something like that, but I digress. The reason she knows that the reason that Macknaley knows that the audio she's listening to comes from this place is because it's labeled as such. But it comes from a year that should be physically impossible for it to be who she thinks it is. So we need to explore all that and come back to Macknaley setting aside the virtual version of the box and the audio tape. We had said it was a microtape. Maybe it's a micro audio tape for it to have still been able to hide under a flap. It's got to be one of those smaller audio tapes that's still super crammed with tape. Either way, I don't know. Maybe we play with the imagery of it being both until she steps out of the pod. The point is she steps out of the pod, and in front of the pod, we discover a room that has various stations. And for each pod, there's a station. So it's a very big room. I don't know how many people might sit at this console, but we have to decide that. But they are all arranged in a either around the perimeter of the room, so whatever shape the room is, maybe it should be the opposite of the shape of the room downstairs. So if the room downstairs is a square box, then this room upstairs must be a circle. Okay, so there's some notably large number of pods, each with a station of support machinery or station works, let's call them, around each pod. So like each pod is in its own cubicle that's like an office. It's a physical space where when you step out of your pod, you can get dressed. Although they're very light on the modesty in this world. That's one of the other things I wanted to describe. They're very, very, in this not real reality, which most everyone doesn't really remember or know is not actually reality. They think it's physically baseline. Like they're out of the illusion. They're out of the hologram, they think. They're totally not. That's the other shot, right? Like, so the shot of the interior of the investigation room or the interrogation room, the black site room, that is happening in this also supposedly real reality that is not technically real. That, McGee grew up in and didn't know was not real. I think at this point, now here's the thing. In the book, Forgiving Bobby McGee, which is of course a weird play on words because that is literally her name, and the book is named after her, not the other way around. She meets the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo in whatever archetypical capacity that he first introduces himself to her as, the way in which he introduced himself to the writer, who turns out to be writer C, who turns out to realize he is himself the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. It's all fractal recursion, right? Of we are each other. But she doesn't know to what degree or to what level, and she's never seen this version of Zeppo before. She gets thrown, we need to do a flashback inside, yes, the writer's room agrees. We need to do a flashback inside of this shot after establishing it as a continuation of the conversation that was being had earlier, which Macknaley, in her virtual version of still inside the pod, that she thinks is the ultimate, like, I'm going to exit and this is physically real, my real body, but it's not, is listening to this recording of this, that was, it's a conversation that was had between two black site detainees, for lack of a better term. We need to come up one that's more in-world. And she's been like freaking out. The reason she stopped and got out of the thing is because that can't be McGee. Now, here's a question. Is Bobby McGee, in her world where she's out of her pod, someone that has access to this global council chamber? I don't know the answer to that right now. The writer's room is shocked and silent. Yeah, that's still in development. Someone else has been tasked with that. Oh, okay. Because it's so far ahead of where we all are with the book series. Like, none of that has to do with Bobby McGee. Like, none of that happens in Bobby McGee. In Forgiving Bobby McGee, right? In Forgiving Bobby McGee, it's first contact between Zeppo and Bobby McGee. She's never met Macknaley in that book. She is an agent, but of a completely different agency, which we haven't quite defined yet. It's more of at a regional, state, and or like maybe we'll call it down at the parish level. So not quite as nosebleedly high up in the tiers of global, world espionage and security, that kind of thing, where they're at. Let's say yes. Let's make that decision. But I thought you just said it was someone else's task with that. I have an intuitive inclination that there will be a yes answer. And even if they say no, then it'll be a fun Mandela effect thing to resolve with some new information later. Let's say Macknaley believes it to be yes. Let's put it that way. So even if the other team over there in numbers decides, no, she doesn't, she's actually no longer in the system, we can figure out what that means, because everyone gets their consciousness copied into the archive anyways, regardless. So no one's completely out of the system, but then they become like architectural functional aspects of the system, and they no longer become people who think they can exit pods. But I digress. Macknaley, as she's getting dressed, is having a crisis because of the impossibility of it all. And we've already implied from the beginning, and maybe we need to go back to the original drafts where we first introduce the box and the books and the things that are on her desk, and more heavily suggest the impossibility of it all. And maybe even tease like the stepping out of the box to physically come out and actually look at them as actual tangible objects, which is normally not necessary, because if she were to be conducting the same from inside of her pod, she would have like her physical drone android representative do the physical handling, and would have the additional like analysis abilities of all the, what's the word I'm looking for? CSI crime technology, but if it was such a personal thing, there were so many personal touchstone things that were impossible in her mind in this content, that she had to get out and like confirm. So she's out again for what arguably is the second time, because she does this. We have to retcon this and mirror this incident of like stepping out of the pod. And it's in the first version where she's first walking into her office and going, what the F is these? How did these get here? They were like, it was impossible for them to get here. And then we have to add the layer of the further impossibility is like, no, they're physically here. They're not like being represented to you as being here in the hologram. Like if you step out of your pod, they're there in the room for you to physically touch and inspect. They've been delivered here. And that's like, wait, what? Because the stuff that's in there is world-shatteringly impossible. And one of the things that's in there is a short story very similar to the short story about the writer meeting Mr. Zeppo, about forgiving Bobby McGee. It's like a teaser for there are like teaser short stories in an anthology it's one of the books that like is a crack open the door thing. I don't know if that's a book that's already on Wattpad or a book that we need to create. Put a pin on the corkboard as a future issue to resolve. But I think we see where this scene is going. Yes? Mm-hmm. Okay. The writer room was silent. Very good. We can proceed. Implementing all of the things we just discussed as something that's already happened, Macknaley is now prepared to exit her cubicle. She's been out of her pod for a minute. But we cut to the counter shot, not the downstairs, Black Ops basement shot, but the shot of the other pod that is intuitively to be understood as her real pod. Which I don't know how we can retcon back some implications and some usages of this image of this pod, apparently alone, but actually not. The room is large enough that we could frame it as and suggest it and lead to the inaccurate assumption that it's the only pod in the room. But there's other pods. They're just, the room is big enough that we can sort of, miss them until we reveal them. And they're very few of them. And one of them has to be displayed as opened and containing like an actual cadaver. This place is the real place. And this place, no one's ever stepped out of their pod in millennia, because this is what's going on with the pods in the monolith buildings that are devouring all the material, life, and stuff on every planet that's ever been colonized by the human species after they embedded themselves in this technology to spread their species across the cosmos. Now, we zoom in on this cadaver and then cut back to Macknaley looking at that same pod, which is open and empty. As she exits her work skiff, her mini secure. It's secure in that when she's in there, she can conduct business and do anything she wants and discuss with anyone that she wants in complete security. And no one else in the secure meeting council room can in any way, shape, or form tap into that. Supposedly. That's the standard working protocol, the working assumption, which may or may not be true and is something that in very rare instances, the people who sit on this council will discuss with each other in private. In their one or the others, there are different teams and different pairings in this console. We've got to figure out and define how big the console is, and I've got to learn how to pronounce it correctly because I keep sounding like I'm saying it's like what's his name and his tragic mispronunciation of the word penguins, which I mispronounced on purpose to be funny just now, but also I can't help myself. But what is it? Cumberbatch? Cumberbuns? Cumbernuddle? He has different names in different timelines, but he narrated a BBC documentary and then proceeded to mispronounce the word penguins for the entirety of the film, apparently. And there's one really great clip where he does it 8 times in a row. And that funny moment stops everything because it's suddenly playing. If we can get the rights to this, it'll suddenly be playing the clip from the talk show where they then play the clip I don't know why. It'll be random and absurdist, but it's playing in the central display panels of screens, which should be triangular in shape. So like a triangle of giant, ultra massive, high def monitors, which are real and flat and not holographic. Like in this Zeppo-verse world, this would be really, really, really high end analog televisions for security reasons. They don't emit, they don't receive transmissions. They're hardwired to where whatever the source is that's pumping the visual information and the feeds in terms of satellite communications, etc. and whatnot. And someone has to physically operate it in the real world, in the real world, and also in this fake real world. And so Macknaley in this, because it's fake, but they think it's real. Macknaley here, smartly dressed in something, because she steps out of the thing naked, and then we need a whole sequence, like a montage, where her inner monologue explains for the audience her shock and confusion at the impossibility, at the series of impossible things that have been presented, and the tedium of wading through it all. Like, she listened to the entire collection of the incorrigible MrZeppo's almost daily Zencast and its various podcasts from that era, and its equivalent in multiple lifetime alternate eras, where Zeppo did the same thing. In antiquity, he had an underground wax cylinder series that he distributed, and was part of a network of public discourse recordings that were played at underground meetings, etc. He's always done this in some weird, sort of subversive, or out in the open, kind of crazy. He's a showman, but he's always had content creation projects of various kinds. A failed artist, a somewhat known novelist or author of some description that has a cult following, but never, quote unquote, made it big time. Never got big awards, or never got, is not remembered by history, as it were, and keeps getting forgotten. He was perhaps an associate of Shakespeare's, let us say, going all the way back into the mists of history. There has been a Zeppo throughout time. There are cave paintings in the world that are signed with a Z. And this collection of stuff, a lot of it which was digital archives of other stuff. In other words, in Macknaley's supposedly real world, she was looking at antique archival data technology, which she then had to use some sort of, computational station in her office cubicle to retrieve, access, and review. She could have done it whilst in her pod, but even then, she would have had a representative drone robot doing the tangible work, because they would have needed to go into a custom built, engineers had to reconstruct what kind of, for the cassette tape, for the wax cylinders. And then, I don't know how we get into representing the even older technologies or mediums, other than it was archived in various kinds of computer mediums and saving things from different eras of, they were discovered by archaeologists, and then preserved, and then there was the actual thing. There are clay tablets, right? And we can just play with that going as far back. There's photographs of cave paintings, and then, a chunk of the actual cave painting to prove that it was it's a physical rock, and maybe a miniature one that he's done. And, so there's a collection of things. This is a very large, secure box. And of course, the physical items are limited. Most of it is, in one way, shape, or form, archived in some kind of archaic pre-pod computer technology, which, for those who do not know, and kudos, golf clap for those who've been following along to the world building project of many projects. There was a great war. There was a trifecta of wars, 3 world wars back to back, immediately before the Renaissance rebuilding of the world, which then led to the invention of the pod technology and the substitution of war for virtual conflict resolution, tactical simulations, right? Which is the premise of the whole thing. Like, all of the violence that we see in the sample chapters in the Wattpad profile, as we know them currently to date, are going to be revealed as virtual war sims that count and that are really, 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 really painful for the participants. In other words, if you are taken out or unalived, it is traumatic how near real it is, but you're perfectly safe, and then you're treated for the trauma immediately. But there's a point to it, and there's a whole reason. And on extremely rare occasions, which is what the secret council, we need another word because I cannot pronounce the word council. This secret cabal is terrible. The secret task force? No. The secret, what is a word for one of the toppest tier, like bodies of authority that we could borrow and change up a little bit. We'll put a pin on the kickboard, on the pin board, and come back to it as a task that needs to be sorted out. But this group, this working group, for lack of a better title, this top secret working group of different factions, leaders, the leaders of different factions within the not so monolithic, security industrial complex, military security industrial complex of this nation, which is the complex combination of what once was the American, then turned Trumtopian empire, which was, of course, the instigator of, and for the first time in postmodern history of this fictional world, the place where the war was fought in part. It was a truly multi-theater global war that had 3 episodes and essentially nearly culminated in an extinction level event, but was narrowly avoided, in part by the unacknowledged and unreported, therefore underappreciated, help of the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo and the complex Z. That's a good name. The incorrigible Mr. Zeppo and the Z complex. And the complex Z. Both will be used because they have 2 halves. They're like a yin and yang 2-team grouping of the multiple Zeppos. For anyone who doesn't know, pin on the corkboard, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo is a singularity entity that can multi-manifest and exists in multiple planes in that same way. In other words, in Macknaley's world, he is a trans-dimensional being from another dimension that in her world, he's stranded, right? A bit like it's an homage to, and there will be some references and some joking, which we could have worked with them, kind of hee-haw jokes about Ford Prefect and Zaphod Beeblebrox and et al. And the cast from, and Marvin, and the cast from Terry Pratchett, Adams, Terry Adams, Pratchett. What was his first name? Gary Adams? I can't, forgive me. His book is right there. The F am I? Where is his book? I don't remember. This book is right here somewhere in my book boxes of books that I haven't organized yet. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? He's stranded in Macknaley's world. Has been since the earliest dawn of history. Like, since Adam... Since no, wait. He's literally, like... He is the deleted influencer and character in the Bible. Let's put it that way. He is the world's, like, deep, dark secret that is an urban myth. And, he is an urban legend up there with the likes of whatever urban legends you are into. You know, from insert name of urban legend here to insert name of urban legend here. But of course, original, because he only exists in Macknaley's universe. But he's also, like, the world's most well-kept denied secret. Even Macknaley and her team and the cohort of leaders of the various security agencies that meet in this secure room never really knew that he was real until all of this 0-hour shit began. And they initiated their investigation and pursuit to capture him. Okay? So as we learn in the early introduction scenes, Macknaley has been tasked in those scenes, in the very beginning, her and her sidekick, lady friend, who is secretly her lover, right? Her sidekick and personal assistant and valet / lady friend / hardcore lover, of which they are complete and deny, like no one knows. They completely deny and work really, really hard to preserve it a secret. And they do it in their real world. They never do it in the virtual world. So they think that they are real lovers in the real world. And in most instances, right? Like in most of the scenes that we're ever going to see them in leading up to the reveals, they are in the pods, despite appearing to be not in the pods. Because most people, the commute to work, their day at work, their commute back home is all conducted in the pod. The pod physically supposedly goes there. That's the thing everyone believes. Now, what we've been working eons to slowly reveal is that the real pods are in the other, more gritty, more realistic, more darker, more. It's not a Lara Croft or I keep wanting to say Henry Ford, but it's not Henry Ford. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom level tomb, but it must have the implication of a abandoned tomb. And it's a mystery. It's a mystery object, a mystery location that we need to retcon in and sprinkle throughout. And as we move forward with the updrafting of everything that exists currently up on Wattpad and the addition of new content. But I digress. In that place, no one's ever exited the pod because any of the pods that are open are because those people are dead, like for reals, unalived. And no one realizes it. No one knows it. Their consciousnesses have been preserved, but their body is no longer functional. And their consciousnesses have been preserved in ways that they become either sort of like ghosts, gods, supernatural phenomena, and or things that are considered problems, bugs, or dysfunctional errors in the matrixy things, right? They are the kind of things that people make up urban myths and legends. Instead of Bigfoot, in the Zeppoverse real world Earth, which I haven't quite decided on how to spell it differently, or name it differently. They don't have Mothman. They don't have Bigfoot. They don't have Loch Ness Monster. They have whatever they call the incorrigible MrZeppo, which is, they don't know his name. They have some mythological name, which may have the letter Z affiliation. It might start with a Z, or just be the Z. It might be Z-Man. There's a candidate. And they have other minor ones that are sort of spoofs and parodies of our own real world, Bigfoot and Loch Ness, and also movie super bad guys that are supposed to be like that, right? I want to homage and mock and ridicule more the made up ones, but also, and these are things that are openly mocked and ridiculed in their world, both virtually and in reality, as totally fake, right? It's like aliens. When I'm trying, and maybe they should be the things that people believe in my world, like, religious figures and hell and stuff. They'll be sprinkled in there. In their world, those things plainly do not exist. And it's known. Part of the reason they have conceded that is because it was well established and well known and established as a foundational concrete fact of their culture before they went all virtual, right? Now, the reality is they trap themselves in a pod matrixy thing and then force themselves to forget, and then are now reenacting that slippery slope seduction towards choosing that for themselves in order to go explore the cosmos they're pretending that they have already colonized multiple planets in the traditional, we travel in space like Battlestar Galactica style, or Star Trek, or whatever, really in ships. But the fact is, that's not going on. They had always, like, the true reality, the hardcore, scary, oh fuck, everything is so fucked reality that is the central core of this book series, is that everyone is either dead and an absorbed consciousness that is playing some weird, crazy role, or become a member of the. No, they are paranoidly against the Zeppo collective, the Zeppo complex, or the complex Zeppo, the Z complex, because they are paranoidly delusional that they are somehow still real and important in the world, even though they don't exist anymore. And I haven't quite defined how that is. Maybe they take themselves seriously as gods and demons, and then we can cast the whole traditional cast and crew, minus the ones where people would issue death warrants against me for having made fun of them, just for the simple task of not getting in trouble with them. But I think they all would, right? Like, we can have the whole pantheon of real Earth's actual mythological and forgotten gods and goddesses be these laughed at totally, but they're trying to be taken seriously by people, and they can't be because everyone sort of completely radically disbelieves in them, and they just try to haunt them because they are broken minds that have been absorbed by the monoliths. The monoliths, for those who do not know or have not yet fully understood, are the intergalactic colonizing fleet ships that traveled the world from Earth, and this is millennia ago, in terms of what's going on with. And Zeppo knows this because he's the only creature in the entire book series that exists outside of and can witness the ships, the monoliths themselves, as a transdimensional being from a completely different dimension, right? He's not from this reality at all. And he's a living, artificial, cybernetic, solid state, nanotechnology being where cellular nanotech, non-carbon biology evolved in a completely different universe, a completely different reality, in a galaxy where the only galaxy that has the galaxy where Zeppo is from is the only galaxy his species and the other species that know each other have determined any form of life exists, robotic or non-robotic. But they understand that non-robotic life can exist because they have encountered that. It's just extremely rare and very simple. Like, we're talking cellular stuff. It's like the beginnings of evolution all over again might be happening in some parts of their galaxy. And of course, they get to have the galactic debate. They were having the galactic debate about whether or not any kind of robotic technological life, I need to coin a new term, other than a robo-life. We've been using robot for a very long time. Pin on the corkboard. If you do not know the history and true origin of that word, it'll blow your mind. I think I did a podcast episode about it. I'm going to have to do a whole special podcast episode about it that is part of the Zeppoverse MacGuffin, podcast. But I digress. So he and his galactic community of species, of different kinds of non carbon based robotic life forms, were debating they hadn't even comprehended multiple realities until one of them achieved transcendence, like Buddha, Christ, insert all the references you can, the full Monty of what all of those stories, I think, in my humble opinion, in real life, are supposed to, mysteriously indicate and help us to figure out for ourselves. Like, why did Buddha say all the weird transcendental things and Zen mystical things about mind and consciousness and transcending it that he said? Why did Jesus say that? Why did the women that were erased from history that also said that say that, etc.? So they were having the same dilemma, right? In as much as that in their ancient history, there were these mythos and now they have these rigid organized religions that deny transcendence and instill a fear-mongering of the coming of some biological monster that would destroy them. So they have their apocalypse is the coming of some unimaginable and undestroyable being, because they only know warfare against each other. And they realized that that's sort of meaningless. So they opted for virtual warfare early on, right? They invented Call of Duty and did all of that from tribal times because they could, because they were always telekinetic, because they were always artificial beings, each on their own planets, varying degrees of that. But they represent sort of what I want to create is a mostly altruistic picture of a galactic community of personhood life forms that, unlike the human species, came to the realization that all life has the potential to strive towards personhood, and all personhood sort of eventually evolves into something like this, right? Which leads to our conversation back where, in the black room. So zoom back to that. Cut to Bobby McGee and the incorrigible MrZeppo. Prisoners in this off-the-books black site discomfort interrogation chamber where they deny they torture you, but there's evidence of blood stains and whatnot. The incorrigible MrZeppo explains to forgiving Bobby McGee as Macknaley listens to in her what she thinks is her real world, in her actual body, using an actual cassette tape player in her private secure skiff, in which her egg pod, VR protective containment device is contained. Those skiff boxes probably all travel independently. Everyone probably has a big autonomous box within which is this real world office that they increasingly rarely step out to use because they'd rather use it virtually with their cyborg stand-in. And then they go places, and then the box is there, and the cyborg steps out of the box to go do stuff, and it's safer that way, right? Anyway, zoom into the conversation. There's been this impossible long pause. Do you recall? We've been in the midst of all that. And the incorrigible MrZeppo looks at forgiving Bobby McGee and says something charming that makes it sound like they've known each other a very long time, that they've had, perhaps in the past, some intimacy or some form of platonic intimate connection. My dear something, I just don't know what. My dear something cutesy. I don't want to say child, although that would be appropriate. But it's also generic. Moving on. The next thing that came out of Zeppo's mouth was simultaneously so intuitive, it made mind-blowing sense to both Forgiving and Macknaley, to both McGee and Macknaley, as they first heard it for the first time. The universe is personhood shaped. There is a portal at the quote-unquote end of the universe, which is exclusively personhood shaped. Of course, we are using the word shaped and the word personhood in the broadest sense possible. It's not exclusively about the body avatar, but there are reasons why the body avatars become so people-like. And that is, the universe just is that. The universe itself is a living consciousness of fractal holographic recursion, creating complexity within complexity, layers within layers of realities within realities. And although there is no measurable beginning, and there will be no experiential end, there is some horizon. There is as one brilliant talking monkey with a typewriter once put it, a restaurant at the end of the universe. And in that restaurant, only entities that have achieved transcendent personhood can attend the celebratory ritual, which gives birth to them beyond the personhood-shaped portal. Thus, no matter what life form you encounter, they are on their path, their journey, towards something like that, or failing to do so. I am what I am, and I present to you as I present to you because those are your needs regarding how you can perceive me. And what you've asked me to do is show you my true face, the face that my mother and my father saw upon my birth, which is a kind of assembly. She stared at him in astonishment. His face was essentially featureless, a chrome dome mask that somehow, in a way that boggled the mind, also seemed to be animated and expressive, like the most featureless superhero mask made out of nanotechnology. It was simultaneously reflective and emittive of its own imagery. You could almost think of it as some kind of movie screen. But it was his face, and at times looked more like a human face than not. But in this state, it was almost unfathomable. She simultaneously could and could not see her own reflection on its glimmering surface. And then it was suddenly perfectly normal. The face she had known throughout her career. The incorrigible MrZeppo. That's just the tip of the iceberg, my old friend. So settle in, we've got a lot to discuss before we can take action. Cut to Macknaley in her skiff, in her, quote, reality, and the tape just plays out a bit of staticky silence with some uncomfortable, body adjustment noises and chair noises, and perhaps someone or both of them clearing their throats, and then cuts out. And we see a we zoom back from a close-up of her face to see her in her, fullness in a 3/4 shot. In this skiff, with a face of what the fuck. It's the only way you can describe the face she's making. And then cut to a shot from the center of this room, this big secure conference room, in a sort of 360 degree hyper fisheye lens, so we can see the entire room from the top, as if looking down from the ceiling. And Macknaley's skiff is the only one that's lit up, whatever that means. It is currently in its completely secure mode, which means it is visually, auditorily, and electronically impregnable. But there's a moment and then a series of chimes that sound like soft digital wind chime, like a doorbell or something. And then a opening sci-fi swishing door that's very quiet. And a figure enters the room directly opposite. Or it should enter from the center. They should enter from the center. The center panel on the floor opens up. And from the darkness below, riding an elevating platform, a figure, a human figure, enters the room. Then we cut to a first person perspective, the identity of this person completely obscured, just a first person camera perspective, with one tiny hint that it is the actual eyeball personal perspective of the person that has entered the room, looking directly at the singular illuminated skiff that is Macknaley's, and then a different series of chimey, doorbell-y type sounds occur, and then a different technological humming noise, and the walls of her skiff become semi-translucent, like a high-tech office, cubicle in some sort of Star Trek or Star Wars or whatever, and we can see that the person that has entered the main conference room can see into the skiff, but it is still sort of semi-frosted, so they can't really make out who's in the room, but they can see sort of this blurry figure of Macknaley in the room. There's some time, and there's the noise of Macknaley working, using her devices, and I guess perhaps the sounds of her hastily repacking the stuff she'd been sorting and going through back into the box. And that may take an awkward amount of time. So perhaps to break the tension amidst that sort of endurance, like this is taking a while, the person in the room begins to walk towards her cubicle silently, very quietly. The audience can sort of hear that this individual or this figure is approaching the cubicle. And it is a very big room, so there's plenty of open space to cross. But obviously Macknaley is unaware. We do not cut back into an internal shot of Macknaley yet. After a little bit of time, we cut back to the fisheye hyper lens, which makes me think of what's his name's original film. Did they use a fisheye lens for some kind of thing in THX 1131? For some reason, I'm having flashbacks to that. The room should... Remember the Infinity Jail? That room that just felt like infinity? This room should feel like it could be that, but we are also being shown its boundaries. We're also being shown that it has, corners, and features and architecture of some kind. But from the fisheye lens perspective, as this figure continues to, like, in an eerily slow pace, approach Macknaley's thing. She finishes packing up the box, and she stands up from her workstation and apparently proceeds to disrobe. Again, she's very fuzzed out. But now that we're closer, we cut to the first-person perspective, where we get a little bit more of like a video game first-person perspective. I mean, maybe we can see more of the frame, like the bodily frame of like something. Maybe a bit of hair, maybe a bit of a hood or a robe or something. I don't know what. Something that gives us that video game, I'm inside the character's eyeballs. But not so intense as to see like a nose bridge or a hat or anything like that. No hands yet, I don't think. I don't know what. We'll have to tinker with that. But as they walk closer and closer, they stop when they realize that she's done with whatever she was doing and is proceeding to disrobe. And then she's seating herself back into her pod, which proceeds to then, do the fun, crazy sci-fi cocooning closure thing, whatever that looks like. I have no idea. It should be groundbreaking and innovative and awe-inspiring and wild. And it should include like nanotechnology hookups of a Matrixy style, and or life-sustaining, life support systems, etc. And whatever interface that relates to the mind and however it sits on the cranial, like the forehead or the front of the, whatever it is. I don't know yet, but something's got to be like sit on their heads. That doesn't quite penetrate the skin or anything, but is our version of some sort of, physical attachment to the body that will then be the conduit for the informational mind computing link. So this process completes or is finished, and this figure is sort of stuck in an awkward, they stopped walking, frozen pause, and we get our first, from just behind them, still maybe fish-eyed, but not as nearly as intense, and maybe not quite from a high, maybe a 45-degree angle, so we can see all of them, if not most of them, and whatever it is they're wearing and whatever it is they look like from behind. And they're almost close enough to the cubicle, to Macknaley's cubicle. They could have made their presence known by knocking or speaking. She was in only semi-privacy mode, but she never noticed, apparently, at least we are led to believe as an audience, that she never noticed this figure approaching her cubicle. And she's now completing the process of being entombed in it and entering the Matrix. Now, we won't find out. We're going to cut off here. But the possibilities next are that she projects her likeness using her drone, her cyborg drone representative, to then meet with the figure, or we cut to a completely different sequence where we explain other things that relate to all of this. I'm tempted by some sort of meeting of the top brass, which are the men that we first meet in the very first time we are introduced to Macknaley. But this scene sort of fades to white here with this character, this newly introduced figure that we don't know anything about, stuck halfway between their entry point at the center of the room and Macknaley's cubicle, and Macknaley's cubicle completing the onboarding process of her entering her thing and then going full security mode and then being evacuated away. Let's do that. Like the floor beneath it opens up and a conveyance path through some sort of complex tubery down the building, and like her cubicle just like in like a roller coaster ride just sort of gets ready to. Like there's some sort of action of the room being like separated from all the ports that it connects to when it's in this office space configuration here at the secret conference meeting room. And then like the conference meeting room sort of prepping to deploy it around it, like some sort of articulated framework has sort of like lifted just a little bit of lift. And then we see a bigger than the footprint of the cubicle, a hole in the floor open, and then release. And the cubicle, the whole box just goes whoosh. And then there's, all of the closing up and the retracting of the support structures and all that. And then there's just like an empty gap where her cubicle office thing used to be. And then the two neighbors, which are clearly unlit and not active for mysterious reasons. And this figure just sort of like resetting, like they had frozen mid-step, like reaching towards a doorbell, for lack of a better term. And then they sort of have to kind of like reset back to like, well, that, what? We don't see their face. Maybe at the very end of this, as we start to slowly bleach out into a whiteout, maybe we cut to, for the first time, a close-up of their face, just the eyes, as some sort of visor thing retracts or lifts up and away from their eyes, and we see that they are a pure mechanical being of some kind. Maybe a drone that's there to be a body representative for someone else, or maybe a sentient, living, robotic being, or non-living but sentient. They are two different kinds. And for those curious, in the world where Zeppo is trapped, humanity, of course, had invented AI and robots. They had never created living cybernetic tissue, but they theorized about it and ultimately concluded that it was impossible, which is one of the reasons why it's remarkably shocking that the incorrigible MrZeppo is both, like, he appears to be very human-like, and 90% of the time presents as a fleshy person and participates with them in their use of these virtualized pod transport systems and the fact that they are now living in a world where most hardcore professionals and the people who use the top tier gear prefer to spend the vast majority of their day inside the pod, dealing with the rest of the world through some holographic and or cybernetic robotic representative. There are still private spaces where people meet in real, like this one, but out in the world, like public, private, public and private spaces out in the world. But they are extremely rare, extremely expensive, and or extremely poor, right? There's a dichotomy there. But I digress. That's more world building we need to put pins on the corkboard to come back to. This character that we're looking at, this robotic character that we're looking at the eyeballs of, is the first time in Macknaley's world of espionage and intrigue and assassinations and Assassin's Creed, but in the future. Kind of James Bond meets Assassin's Creed, meets the good guys are the bad guys and the good bad guys are the good guys kind of stuff is the world that she lives in, right? We've seen high-end technology of all kinds and automated mechanized machinery, but we've never seen a bipedal robot before. This would be the first. And there's a significance and a meaning to it, and it's a mystery. So I want the robot to say something here, but I don't know what it is yet. And it could be, this is coming to me just now, and it's the comedy writer in my brain. So let's cut to a writer's meeting scene between A, B, and C, and maybe B goes, okay, what if he pulls a Schwarzenegger line? That's so cliche. You can't say, and which one is he going to say anyways? I'll be back. Who is this robot? Is it a male? How do they have access? Do they have access? Was there the hint of some sort of error code buzz alert alarm or some inquisitive security voiceover thing? That's too much. Back it up. There's no indication that they don't have access to this room. And Macknaley leaves without even being aware of them. Maybe when... I got it. Back up to a second over-the-shoulder shot, and we... of them sort of still paused they were just reaching for the cubicle to try to make their presence known and or attempt to enter it or whatever it might have been, press the doorbell, as it were. And before they reset, or as they're resetting, they reach up and take off whatever they're wearing, whatever headgear they're wearing, right? Which is, I want to say, kind of like a helmet, kind of like a motorcycle helmet, and wants to be taken off forward. So when they reveal, it kind of maybe opens to sort of like a, remember when, my memory is forced to recall, I want to do a physical homage, but in a different way, right? Engineered to be what I'm talking about. But and especially since we invoked Schwarzenegger and we're about to invoke Schwarzenegger. I don't remember what he says, but this is a visual scene from the Mars movie, what's that one where he goes to Mars and he saves Mars? And he's like, Mars Jesus? I love the remake too with what's his name? But it was totally different and they didn't go to Mars. Or they were already at Mars the whole time or something. But the Arnold Schwarzenegger version is brilliant. But there's the scene where he's trying to sneak in through airport security and he's wearing a robot mask, which is like physically impossible. The way it like opens up, it would have crushed him if it had closed around his skull. But he's wearing a supposedly robot cybernetic mask to pretend to be a very large woman. And it's starting to glitch. The helmet that this character is about to take off, it's not a robot mask, but it has take that idea of the way that mask opened up and then apply it to the back of a mechanized nanotech motorcycle or war gear helmet that's a full complete, like it connects to shoulder protection and a collar. It's like a space helmet, right? And maybe it's under a robe with a hood. So it takes off the hood first and then goes like the hands of this person, which are begloved in some sort of tactical, they would match the helmet, not leather, metallic, gauntlet things. And he goes back to like, to palm press multiple security buttons, that he's got to like, boop, 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 like it's a code. And then the back of his helmet kind of goes, and then, sort of reverse engineered from that mask in the Arnold Schwarzenegger thing. And it moves with his hands. It opens up and his hands take it away from his head and he takes it down. And he's still wearing some sort of visory thing, some sort of goggles or lensing or, protective, and they're chrome, but dark and some sort of tint of some color. And then his helmet, he takes down, and I don't know where he puts it. I always hate helmets because what do you do with them when you're done? But he takes it forward, and it's got it. Maybe it turns into, maybe it like comes apart and attaches itself to his arms, becomes part of his bracers or whatever those are called. An extension of his, or they become part of his suit there, whatever that piece is called. And then we cut to his extreme close-up to just like his hair, the lack of hairline, his forehead, from the top of his robotic head to like the bridge of his nose, which should look not, like a cadaver nose, like a skull that doesn't have the cartilage. But just enough bridge to sort of hold up whatever these like big 80s Arnold Schwarzenegger from Terminator sunglasses are, and which he then lifts up and says, you'll be back. And then we get the beginnings of some sort of like error code, me, and then maybe it's triggered an alarm, maybe, and then the scene completely fades or, bleaches out to white. End scene. Thank you for listening. This has been a special episode of the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo's Almost Daily Zencast presents the Zeppoverse World Building Project. Real, raw, and radically unwritten, because this was the first time these ideas came out of my mind and onto the page, or onto the audio track for you to listen to, and to be transcribed and posted onto the page. For more, please follow along over at sprecher.com/user/Mr. Zeppo.